It is now a wonderful pleasure to transition to our first panel around solutions. And I see all the books, almost all of them are gone. So that means you all have some good reading coming up. It is a pleasure. We have 4 incredible panelists today here to talk about their contributions to the book and also solutions that they're seeing at the national stage. So first, I'd like to bring up from the Chicago Community Trust, Ianna Kachoris. Ianna? Yeah, here she comes. Okay, great. I'm really excited for her work, and I'm really excited for her to talk about the ways in which community informs what they're doing around solutions. Next, I'd like to bring up Dafina Williams. Dafina? Yeah, right here in the front. Okay. She's from the Opportunity Finance Network, also known as OFN. And I'm really excited to hear her discussions about how capital moves and capital absorption. Next, I'd like to bring up Kevin Carey, who's from New America, right up front, ready to go, who I'm really excited is going to talk to us today about education and the role that plays in our solutions. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to bring up Katherine McKay from the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. Thank you so much for joining us. And I am going to place your name cards here as we transition.
All right.
And Ray, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Well, good to be with you all again. Thank you, Sam, once again. I had questions around baby bonds and home ownership and stock investments. For Derek, I'm sorry we didn't get to those. You would have loved to have heard what he's going to say about that, but now we have 2 solutions panels to look forward to, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about those things. So just very briefly, before we get to our fabulous panelists, let me just set the stage a little bit. You all have copies of the book. Great to see that. Just a little bit of context on how the book came together. I'd say there's 3 things, but for the pandemic, creating money in the budget and time, I don't think there would have been a book. So, there was a benefit of being stuck in my basement for a year and a half. Secondly, and more importantly, I think we were in this moment where we were witnessing enormous change, demographic, technological, social, cultural, political, and in my previous book with Phil Longman, The Next Progressive Era, we learned that it's often out of chaos comes and out of great change that you have an opportunity to remake the social contract, to do big things, to generate new ideas. And we thought in a general sense, we want to be ready for that moment. So what ideas could we put on the table that could get into the mix for what we were hoping would be an era of large policy change, and we did in fact see some of that. And third was really around the idea of wealth itself. I think the view has been, and I think this is informed by the previous panels, that the way you build wealth is to save whatever excesses you might have out of earned income. And I think we've learned from Derek and many others that this savings approach, while important and should be encouraged, is really not going to move the needle. It's not really going to build substantial wealth. You do need institutional change for that to happen. And we were thinking, too, that we need to get out of this excess labor market framework to build wealth and think about institutional change, as well as take note of the fact that wealth was being created around low wealth people, but they were getting no part of it whatsoever. So we were eager to put ideas on the table that created new sources of wealth and ownership, for the bottom portion of the population, the bottom half of the population that only has 1% of the nation's wealth. So we were really trying to do those things, really try to spark a discussion, be ready for a big moment in the policy world. And, really just try to put these ideas into one place. So today, we are really blessed to have 3 of the 4 authors, contributors to the book. And we're also fortunate to have Katherine McKay, who did not author a chapter, but her DNA is woven into every other contribution from Aspen in the book. Yeah. Yes, thank you. So what we're going to do here is I've asked each of the panelists just to speak for 3 or 4 minutes, introduce themselves, their work, and kind of what was the big idea with your essay. All right. And we're going to go down the line one at a time. And after they do that, I have questions for them specifically, and then I have questions for the panel. And then, of course, there's going to be time for you. I want to thank Sam again for being generous with the panel. We have about an hour for this discussion. So get your questions ready. And with that, what we're going to do is start at the House level and begin with Katherine. Then we'll go to Kevin, then Dafina, and then close out with Ianna. Okay? So Katherine, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. As Ray mentioned, I was involved in the book, and as one of the research staff at Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program, what that meant was reading every one of those essays in depth, line by line. And if I can do it, you should too, because it actually really is a great set of ideas to just let roll around in your mind. One of the things I love about it is it's also reflected in the most recent publication that my team and I put out this spring called 101 Solutions for Inclusive Wealth Building. We know how to do this. Like, it's not that hard for people to build wealth if all of those supporting structures are in place to support them, and if there are not oppressive structures constraining choices, making it very difficult to make optimal choices within what you've got to do in the time you've got to do it. And so for us, the research that we've been doing really focuses in on what is the household experience as they try and either succeed or don't succeed at wealth building. The vast majority of people are saving. They're putting, even if it's $3 aside, they're putting it aside when they can. And something happens. And that cycle of something happens, I put money away, I draw it down. I put money away, I draw it down. It never rolls up to what we've started talking about as investable sums. And so my interests right now are really looking at what are the drivers of that, the many drivers. And I mean, truth be told, in every last one of them, there's the additional, okay, so how does this work out for white folks? And how does it work out for everyone else? And how does it work out for the Black folks who've been explicitly targeted for harm? So, this is part of every single conversation that we have to have. And to do our work well, we need to make sure that, I think I really wish I could remember which one of the panelists earlier said, like, people just need the basic resources. It was you, Derek. Regardless of whether we're living in a capitalist society or a communist or socialist one, there's a certain set of things that you need to live and thrive. We absolutely have the tools to do that. There are really good ideas in that book, in that report. None of them, they're reciting all of you and others, and on this stage. So I think in terms of the experience, the key thing to understand is how crushing the level of precarity that the majority of households are facing really is, how difficult it is to navigate and succeed within a world where every mistake has such enormous consequences and can be punished for so many years, and where those mistakes are really, the punishments are so much worse depending on who you are and what you look like in ways that are really wrong and unfair.
Thank you, Katherine. So she did a great job of getting 101 solutions down to 3 minutes. Thank you. And I think you were probably referring to Lisa Servan's research, where over and over folks talked about the importance of stability, right? And they really wanted that for themselves and for their kids.
Absolutely.
It's very powerful. Let me ask you one question as a follow-up, Katherine. A lot of your work points to the importance of emergency savings in helping families both realize their stability goals and their upward economic mobility goals. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So at this point in time, 45% of US households don't have routinely positive cash flow. That is that most of the time their income is equal to or more than their expenses. It's really hard to survive that way. It just is. And we're talking about such a huge component of our country. Emergency savings is what it takes to manage life in the circumstances that we all live within. It is the difference, as we often say, between having a car to get you to work and not. It is also, I want to highlight the role that it plays with the health stuff. So much of the anxiety and stress around money is your immediate problems. And how often would that stress and depression and anxiety have a chance to just like simmer down and not sit inside you? I think that's one of the things that really, like, in addition to just being able to handle the ups and downs that life will deal every last one of us, and in addition to having some protection against the unfairness that life will deal some of us, it's more than just the money. It's also what it does for you inside yourself.
Right. Thank you. I'm always struck by the fact that this field started out 30 years ago, kind of in a patronizing way, saying we know what low-income people need. They need long-term wealth. And we sort of backed into the idea of emergency savings because of the lived experiences people trying to save. And now it's become a really important part of the field.
Yep.
So we've listened and learned, and I think we're more responsive than we were before. So thank you. Kevin, you've been thinking about higher education and education most of your career. Can you summarize your essay for us?
Yeah, thanks, Ray, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me and to all of you for coming today. It's a great privilege to have this conversation. So the essay I wrote, I was struck by the conversation we had before lunch and the discussion of narrative and language and how the words that we use shape how we understand the world, and that shapes our sense of what's possible and what's not and what's right and what's wrong. And so what I wrote about was the idea of college degrees as assets. And this is a very common frame, very common vocabulary that we use in talking about higher education. I think we probably have heard some of it today. And for logical reasons, degrees are things that people kind of own. Doesn't belong to anyone else. It's your degree. Degrees are things that have a long-term economic return associated with them, in the sense of if you have one, you're more likely to make money than if you don't. And degrees are things that people are expensive, and that you sort of conjure up a lot of money for at some point in your life. But the problem is that degrees are also not assets in lots of ways. You can't sell your degree and use it to pay off the loan that you used to get it, for example. You can't transfer it to someone else. And this comfort with the idea of degrees as assets, I think, is made us comfortable with the idea that it's okay to borrow a lot of money to buy one. And that's a very cross-ideological belief. People may have different opinions, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a liberal, about how much money the government should spend to sort of subsidize higher education. But over the last 30 or 40 years, as we've essentially by default converted our higher education system into a debt finance system, that's been a consensus. There have been people of all different kinds of political persuasions who have been on board with that. Including, of course, the institutions themselves, which are very comfortable being paid in borrowed dollars. And so where this starts to really intersect with the discussion that we're here talking about today is that once you become very comfortable with the idea that higher education should be financed with debt, and you overlay that with a system of structural racism, you get what we have. We know that there is a student debt crisis in the Black community in America. Black students are much more likely to borrow. They borrow more money, and they are more likely to not have the resources to pay their loans back once they graduate. So what that creates is, I would say, three problems, two which are kind of obvious and one which maybe not as much so. The first two are if you're borrowing, then the price of higher education went up, right? You're not just paying tuition, you're paying interest. You're paying penalties, you're paying fees. So you have to pay more for the same thing that other people are getting because you come from a community that had been denied wealth, and therefore you have to borrow because you don't have that wealth to borrow, to fall back on, or to borrow against. You can't take out a home equity loan if you don't own a home. Second of all, we know that degrees are devalued in the labor market for Black people. You have to essentially get one more degree than white people in order to have the same purchase in the labor market. So you pay more on the front end for something that's worth less on the back end. The third thing is that implicitly, when we think about something as an asset, we tend to be comfortable with letting the free market determine its quality. There's not a lot of government regulation about exactly what a house looks like, right? We just figure that people will buy the kinds of homes that they want to, other than a little regulation around, FHA loans, things like that. But you pay for the inspection, you buy the home that you want. Cars are often debt financed, right? The free market determines what kind of features the cars have and all the rest of it. And we have unconsciously imported that same perspective on our institutions of higher learning and just assumed that the quality is there, right? And so again, regardless of your opinion, where you are on the political spectrum, we mostly just focus on the price of things. Again, we know what happens when historically discriminated against and marginalized communities are exposed to the vagaries of the free market. That is a recipe for predation. That is a recipe for exploitation. That is a recipe for unequal access to things that people really, really need. And in fact, we see exactly that happen. And so the third thing that's kind of happening in the middle is that for a lot of Black Americans, paying more on the front end for a product that's often not as good and then is devalued in the labor market going forward. So there's obviously a lot that has to be done around price and around debt. And we have a big active conversation about student debt forgiveness going on right now in Washington, D.C. I work at a think tank called New America in D.C. And we have a lot of conversations around the price of college going forward and can we bring tuition down? But I would say we also need to not give into that idea that we can just assume the market will provide quality. We need to look hard at the institutions that are serving our communities and not just sort of step back and have faith that everything will be fine. I think there are more things we can do to protect people who are coming into the higher education market. I think there are more things we can do to govern our public institutions. And I think there are more things we can do to hold accountable institutions that, after all, are very much benefiting from these government programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So regulation, consumer protection, really, and apply that to higher education. I think that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned student loan relief. I'm sure everybody in the room would love to hear your thoughts about whether or not that was a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very supportive of student loan relief, both in the long term and going forward. We'll see what happens. It's very much President Biden's plan to forgive $10,000 or as much as $20,000 of outstanding loans is a novel interpretation of an existing federal law and is now being challenged in federal courts. It's very unclear about whether it will stand up or not. It's a new issue. And so we're kind of finding out week to week, day to day about how that's going to go. But the thing is, during the pandemic, we paused the federal student loan collection apparatus, right? No loans have been due since March 2020. And the machine is going to kind of start up again. The collection machine is going to start up again in a couple of months. But we didn't pause the student loan granting system at all. So we've been producing hundreds of millions of dollars of new debt during that time that still sits with people. And I would say, regardless of one's opinion about student loan forgiveness, again, I'm a supporter. It's a kind of an idiosyncratic and very high stakes way to go about doing things. You have to have the right president and the right time, and maybe it's legal and maybe it's not. And it's just for the people who have debt now. It doesn't affect anyone who's taking on loans in the future. I don't think that's the best way to go about making sure that people don't have super burdensome student loans. And so there is a big unfinished project of restructuring the system so all this debt doesn't exist in the first place.
Great point. Thank you. Dafina, in your essay, you had a couple of really memorable lines about CDFIs, financial first responders, capillaries of the financial system. Maybe you all came up with that at the Opportunity Finance Network. Can you say a little bit more about your essay and your work?
Sure. So I'm Dafina Williams. I'm very excited to be here. I am also a Philadelphia native and a Temple graduate. And this is the first time I've been on a panel with so many people from North Philly in the room. So And I represent Opportunity Finance Network. We are a national trade association of community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, and we're also a CDFI ourselves. I actually have a couple of our OFN members are represented in the room today. So if I say anything you don't like, I'm sorry. So, our essay was really focused on the role that CDFIs can play in, really building a more equitable society and really helping communities build wealth. And I think the big ideas essentially are, unequal access to affordable, responsible finance has deprived communities of avenues to build wealth, right? Like not new information for the folks in this room. Too many communities are both not well served by traditional finance and are, ripe targets for predatory lenders. And so CDFIs are really trying to step into a gap, which I will stop using that word soon, but really trying to help fill capital gaps by being mission-driven lenders and by putting essentially the people over the profit. So we like to say that, we're profit-making. We let it make enough money to keep the lights on, but a lot of CDFIs are nonprofit loan funds. And the focus is really on making sure that we're delivering resources and capital to communities based on the actual lived experiences and the needs of the communities, and not based on what we think they need or what types of investment we think that they need. While I was preparing for this, I kept coming back to, I think, a criticism that I've heard of CDFIs that's been coming up more and more. And it's the idea that, can you lend your way out of poverty? Right. And I think that is a really fair and important kind of conversation for, mission lenders to have. But I want to charge us all to think about it a little bit differently, which is that acquiring and building assets requires capital. And many communities just don't have it, right? It's just not there. There are not banks in their communities. There's no one there to really provide that capital. And when they do, it's high cost. It's not good capital. It can cause you to actually be stripped of assets in the long term instead of building it. And so CDFIs are really focused on how do we actually invest in, help purchase, acquire family and community assets, whether that's small dollar mortgage financing that banks won't touch because it's time consuming or expensive to do that, or microloans of $500 so that people can actually get a business idea off the ground, all the way up to things like, okay, we're going to provide, deeply subordinated debt capital so that an affordable housing project can actually get off the ground because that's the piece of the capital stack that nobody else wants to be involved in, right? So really thinking through how can we make this idea of marrying capital with justice, and how do we do that in a way that is really focused and intentional on the actual needs of the folks on the ground, but also in a way that's sustainable. So I think that's the other thing that's interesting about the model. Yes, we're using debt to help people acquire assets, but as soon as that loan gets paid from that small business, it goes back into a pool of capital that we then move on and serve the next borrower. So it's kind of taking the best pieces of traditional finance, but layering them with this justice lens to ensure that we're actually investing in and helping to improve community outcomes, and not just saying, oh, let me buy a piece of land somewhere and throw a building on it and then I'm gone forever. And it's about being rooted in and of the communities to really make sure that there's partnership there. And I think the other thing that's really interesting about CDFIs is that in order to sort of get the credential of being certified as a CDFI by the Treasury Department, you actually have to be accountable to the communities that you're saying you're serving. At least 60% of your lending and investing has to go in low income or moderate income markets. You have to have a representation from the communities on your board in order to be certified. And so there's a very intentional focus on making sure that we're working with people on the ground, that they have a seat at the table, that what the community needs and wants is central to how that money is going to be invested and lent. And I think that I'll get into some of the other things. I think the CDFI industry is in an inflection point in a lot of different ways, which I think we'll touch on in some of the other remarks. But we're really working in the markets that others have deemed too risky or not profitable enough to warrant the investment in. And I think the main thing we're constantly pushing up against is, there's just this idea that poor people are not worth investing and lending money to, and that you can't actually make investments in the communities, in low-income communities or to low-income people and get paid back. And I think CDFIs are proving that that's wrong on both of those counts.
So I'm curious then, what's your secret sauce for keeping default rates comparable to traditional finance institutions? Is it this accountability and working in the community?
It's a couple of things. I think one is that you also are required as part of your certification to be a CDFI to provide technical assistance or development services alongside the capital. So it's not just, oh, we're going to give you a mortgage product. It's also, we're going to give you some homeownership counseling to go along with that mortgage product to make sure that you understand the financial commitment of taking out a mortgage. We're going to make sure that you're able to actually, afford this capital and repay it. And so that's a little bit of the secret sauce. We call it Capital Plus. It's not just about making a quick loan and how much, what's the interest rate spread and how much can I make off of it and walking away. It's saying, I'm trying to help you get a individual or community asset. It is better for all of us if you don't get your home foreclosed on, your small business doesn't close down. It's better for us as lenders. It's better for the community. It's better for your family. And so we're partners. It's really kind of going back to the old school, like community bank model that, you actually know people. Our loan officers are out in the streets. They're in and of the community. We've got, making sure that there's language accessibility, really making sure that we're taking the scary parts out of the experience of going and, getting capital from a bank. I think a lot of the communities we work in, people are afraid to even ask for a loan because they know they're going to get turned down. And so we're trying to combine, like I said, some of the best parts of mainstream finance, but really layering in some of these additional resources that we know people need to be successful.
Thank you. Ianna, you and I had the good fortune of doing some work together at Pew back when we were both in DC, right? But now you're committed to doing something about the racial wealth gap in the city of Chicago at the Chicago Community Trust. Tell us a little bit more about your essay and that work.
Sure. And maybe I can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
So maybe I can start a little bit to say more about who the Chicago Community Trust is and why we care about this issue. We are the community foundation for the Chicago region. I am the funder in the room. There may be others, hopefully, really thinking about this issue. But we, over the last few years, went through a strategic planning process under the leadership of our former CEO, Dr. Helene Gale, who I co-authored this piece with for the volume that Ray edited.
And she's now the president of Spelman?
That's correct. Mm-hmm. That is correct. We miss her dearly, but we also have a new CEO who's taken up this mantle. We're not shifting our perspective, but when we looked across the Chicago region and really as a community foundation, we can often be all things to all people. People look to us to support housing or human services or a whole range of issues, and really wanting to be much more intentional about what we were doing and what role we were playing in the city of Chicago. And we named our North Star goal as closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. I will take back to our team whether that's the right term to be using. Maybe it is divide.
And we need a new word for gap here.
Yes. But we really saw that when you got to the heart of the matter, whether it was health or housing or any education, at the root was this racial and ethnic wealth gap that we experience as a city. It is no secret that Chicago is, I think, like Philadelphia, one of the most segregated in the country. And we had the great fortune of a local research entity, the Metropolitan Planning Council, doing a study on what does the segregation in our city, what does it cost us as a city and as a region, and really put a number to that issue. And then it's not just the impacts on the communities who are marginalized, but it affects all of us. And we were really compelled by this notion, and that it's something that we needed to take up and really apply that lens to our work. And it fundamentally reshaped how we think about our role as a community foundation, as a civic institution, and as a leading entity. And the responsibility that we have also as a philanthropic institution that is built on wealth that has been accumulated largely by white Chicagoans and others over time. And so we feel a strong responsibility in how we think about that work. And so our strategic plan really thinks about a number of things, some of which have come up in the course of conversation today. One is how do we address critical needs? We know that there's, people are not going to be able to build wealth if they don't have that emergency savings or that solid foundation, but also how we think about wealth at the individual level, how we grow household wealth, and then at the community level, how we invest in communities and how that leads to wealth creation at a broader scale, as well as how do we help build collective power? How do we activate community voice to be the determinants in their own future and really have those stories and that narrative really drive what are the solutions that we can aim towards? And so as we developed the strategic approach, we knew that grant making alone wasn't going to get us to that idea of closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. And so we've also at the same time thought about what our role is in advocating for policy and systems change. And that's the role that I occupy at the Trust, really thinking about how do we use the voice and the platform we have, what are the policy issues, how does that go hand in hand with some of the piloting and investments we can make in innovative programs and vehicles. So when Ray asked Helene and I to do a piece for this volume, we really thought about, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of how we can rethink wealth policy and the way that we approach this in this very integrated way. And so our essay was really about how do we really think and transform the potential solution sets that are on the table. Many of the ideas that we had in our essay were talked about today earlier about how if we only think about the individual and the role of the individual playing in the choices that they make, et cetera, without thinking about the frameworks and institutions that sort of shape those choices, as many folks have talked about, we're leaving so many different ideas and things on the table that we should be thinking about. And so our essay really touched on the potential for how do we hold institutions accountable for their own behavior in creating the structures and the systems that enable people to build wealth. So instead of focusing just on the individual, how do we look at those institutions, banks, public policies, any sort of government lending institutions, et cetera, and really think about what responsibility is. And so our call to action really was, how do we apply this lens as we are asking ourselves at the Trust, where do we invest? Where do we use our voice to really think about how could we redesign systems with the express purpose of building wealth in communities? And then finally, I will just say one of the things that we think is really important, and as we even sort of live into our strategic plan around, advocating for homeownership and how we do that work, we're not thinking about homeownership on its own. We're also thinking about what are the community investments that are being made around those communities where people are buying homes, because we know wealth isn't going to be created if there aren't those community amenities that people find value in those communities. So we're taking this very intersectional approach. And we were really grateful to Ray for asking us to do the volume, because it really helped us clarify our thinking quite a bit about what role we can play as a civic institution in doing that work.
Thank you, Ianna. Very exciting. I mean, I think this is a living example of centering equity in your work. And I'm also glad to see foundations engaged in public policy work. You don't always see that, so it's inspiring.
Yeah, I feel very lucky to be where I am.
Yeah. So give me an example of an institutional change that you're optimistic about at the Trust.
So one that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about right now, and it wasn't something that we lifted up in the volume, but we have in Cook County, in which Chicago is, I think, the second largest county in the country, we have a tax foreclosure system that is actually working against the interests of communities and reinvestment in communities. And it both sort of strips folks of wealth when folks have trouble paying their taxes. They have their properties can go into an annual tax sale. People then have the option to collect those taxes from individuals, and if those taxes cannot be brought current, then it goes into another sale, the tax scavenger sale. And we currently have 30,000 properties on the south and west side of Chicago, as well as southern suburbs, that are trapped in the system, and that it creates a very arduous and difficult process, intensive legal processes to go through to reclaim properties for investment. So it's both extractive on the homeowner from the beginning of the experience of going into the tax sale, but is then sort of locks these properties, which are of value to communities, in this scavenger sale, which is just a horrible name because it sounds as bad. It operates as bad as it sounds. And so we have an opportunity. We've been able to support some research at the University of Chicago, looking at what's happening with these properties and the sort of the drag that it has on community reinvestment. And we've actually gotten the attention of the Cook County Treasurer's Office, which runs the sale. And we have some significant hope that we can reform that system. We have to change some laws about the required running of this scavenger sale. But there's momentum and there's some public will that has been built up over time that we think that there's an appetite to get rid of that system and then figure out what's an alternative system that can better reclaim those properties. We've been working with the Center for Community Progress, an entity folks may be familiar with.
Very inspiring. That's great. I mean, it's institutional change. We all agree it's important. It's actually hard work. And this is a really good example. So I have two questions for each panelist. And then after that, we're going to turn it to all of you. I'm going to just group them and go down the line. So the two questions are, first, is there anything you heard on any panel before today, that you just feel like you want to comment on, some insight, some big idea that is relevant to your work? And the second question is, take the idea that you're passionate about. What would it take to reach more people, to scale up the idea? So, Katherine, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So this is actually something that I heard from one of today's panelists at an event 2 weeks ago. And that is Marquita said, I really wish that white people would be more comfortable telling their stories too. And in the group we were in, one of the reactions was like, oh, I don't know if I'm supposed to even am I supposed to tell you my story when it is just like, my dad fought, we got GI benefits, I went to college when states still paid for college, and I'm white. And I've been thinking a lot about that. My own story is a lot more complicated in that, sure, grandpa with the GI benefits, born middle class, but then domestic violence, homelessness, public benefits, education for me was the way out, and having to appreciate how much there were lucky breaks in there. And those lucky breaks were not so much luck as a combination of luck and someone being a little bit less interested in slamming the door on my mother's face. And I think it is really important to talk about, because we all do have a story of how we are where we are. And, I'm very much aware that my own story, not that many people in the room have had all those experiences. And I'm still here. And the fact is that took some luck and some white privilege too. It's a lot to come through all that and then end up doing the work that I am so privileged and grateful to be able to do. And in terms of an idea that has me really excited, there are two things. You can't limit me, Ray. The first one.
That's still good from 101.
Yes, thank you. The first one is really just, I mentioned the vast majority of people are saving. What's happening is that the pieces of the day-to-day financial life are not lining up. And I think that the momentum around cash is awesome. I think that for millions and millions and millions of families, the difference between their efforts paying off and their efforts not paying off, that cash infusions are really often the thing that could have just changed everything. It can be the twig in the stream instead of needing to be the Army Corps of Engineers and dig a whole new canal system. We got to do a lot of new things too, but I do think that the cash piece is very inspiring in that it unlocks a lot of what people are trying to do for themselves and provides a level of success and return that's important in terms of the functions of wealth in people's lives, that sense of advocacy and control.
And you're talking about both kind of the natural experiments around the expansion of the child tax credit or universal basic income experiments. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. It'd be interesting to have a debate about universal basic income versus universal basic assets. Or do we do both? Right? There we
Let's
are.
do both.
There's the answer.
I'll leave it at both and not say my second thing.
When we get into a political environment, we might not be able to do both, but it's a great debate. All right, Kevin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I've been thinking about a theme I've heard in a couple of the discussions today about the kind of the weaponization of this idea of individual responsibility, particularly, I would say, the very specific American definition of individual responsibility. And I contextualize that in my work around education. I work in both K through 12 education and higher education. And in K through 12 education, we have a lot of high schools in this country where the graduation rate is not what anybody would want. Only, 50, 60, sometimes fewer percentage of students will graduate. And we can have a lot of debates about the who's and the what's and the whys around that, but at least people will concede that that's a problem. Generally speaking, there's not a lot of argument about that it's not optimal to have a high school where only 6 out of 10 students graduate. What happens then is that the 6 out of 10 who make it through, mostly what they do is some of them won't go to college at all. And then of the narrower group that do go on to college, they mostly go someplace local. Most people don't travel to college; they stay near, where they grew up and they lived. And often, what they'll end up in is an institution that is like their high school, under-resourced, degrading in the sense that it's falling apart, but maybe in other senses of that word as well. Marginalized, underfunded, largely unaccountable. And then a lot of those students will drop out, often pretty quickly, sometimes because they borrowed money, worse than if they had never gone to college at all. But because between May and September, they turned 18, we say, well, that's all on you. You're an adult. You didn't take advantage of the opportunity that we gave you. You're welcome. You didn't take advantage of the opportunity of higher education that you were given, and the fact that you failed means that you're a failure. And certainly no one else has any responsibility for that failure. Even though same students, just separated by, in some cases, a matter of months. And so that's how I see that theme kind of running through my work. Mm-hmm. The thing that I do kind of feel more hopeful about and makes me feel positive is that I do think, I really, and this connects back to our discussion around loan forgiveness. The loan forgiveness movement that's happening and the loan forgiveness action that took place, and again, hopefully we'll see if the courts allow us to do it, will go through, really came through a very different channel of political action, right? There's a traditional way that, federal higher education policy has made interest groups and, organizations like mine come and offer their opinions, and, bills are offered, and that system didn't work. That system led us to the student debt crisis, either through its action or its inaction. And the student loan movement was really a grassroots movement. It was a movement of younger people. It was a movement very much mediated and accelerated by information technology, by social media. And it was really a direct action on the presidency, not sort of going through traditional channels saying you need to take advantage of the power you have when you have it and act now on behalf of the communities that brought you here and the communities that need the help the most. And I get a lot of hope from that. I get a lot of energy from that. And I think we should learn from that example and see where else we can use it.
If I can just make a brief connection between Katherine's and Kevin's comments. I mean, debt relief just instantly improves a balance sheet, right? Like instantly. And the effect is actually disproportionate because student loans disproportionately displace your ability to accumulate wealth. Can't save for retirement, buy a home. It's harder to marry, things like that. And so, I wonder, Katherine, and you've written about this, I mean, should we be thinking about the hard path of trying to help families save and build wealth and assets, whether institutionally or behaviorally, or just do more debt relief? We can come back to that, but I just think there's a really interesting connection here between student loan relief there and the other kind of debt relief that you've talked about as well.
Yeah, so I don't think it's a coincidence that the level of households with negative net worth, as in their debts outweigh their assets, spiked up. Yeah, it was the great financial crisis. It was also when we changed the student loan rules. And 80% of people with negative net worth have student loans, and it's not a small amount. It is $40,000 almost. So I think there's something very real in that. And those of us who have those loans know exactly what's not going in our retirement accounts.
Right.
So definitely, something to say for the debt piece of it too.
Dafina, what did you hear that inspired you, and how do we get more CDFIs in more communities?
In my day job, I lead OFN's federal policy efforts. And so I've been hearing a lot today about the role of the federal government either to cause harm by its policymaking or to potentially remedy some of those harms by making different decisions. And, during the pandemic, CDFIs we call ourselves, we're the best kept secret in finance, but because of some things that happened, particularly in the implementation of the Paycheck Protection Program, where those funds were not reaching small business, the very small businesses led by people of color, et cetera, we became suddenly the solution to everything, to all of society's ills, right? So there was all of this attention, both from the public and private sector coming into the CDFI industry. And with that attention, the money followed. And so in a lot of ways, even though these were the darkest days of the pandemic, both from a, social justice, economic, and kind of health perspective, our industry did better than it ever did. We received massive inflows of capital from new partners on the corporate side, but also significant new investment in, coming in from the federal government. But I think the thing that people don't realize is that it's a drop in the bucket compared to the scale of the need and the scale of the challenges we're trying to solve for here. The CDFI industry has about $222 billion in total assets amongst 1,400 institutions. JP Morgan Chase is $1 trillion bank. And so we're being asked to kind of push the big rock up the hill and save everybody and, invest and save our small businesses and make sure everybody has a safe, affordable home they can live in and build community centers. But the level of investments doesn't match the task we're trying to do. And so, it's great that the Treasury Department made $12 billion available to CDFIs and minority depository institutions. It's like pouring water on cracked desert earth, right? It's gone immediately. The need is so severe that we need, 10, 20, 30 times that level on an annual basis to really be able to actually make progress on, the issues we're trying to solve. And so, I'm constantly thinking about in this new political environment that we're about to step into, that's going to get even harder. It's hard to convince people that, you should care about poor people and you should care about communities of color. Telling them that they should spend the federal government's money to do that is an even harder sell for certain people. And so I'm really laser focused on making sure we don't backtrack and that we don't lose some of the gains, both in sort of the recognition of the role of this industry, but also just like, the fact that you need to invest dollars alongside in order to make sure that we're able to actually make meaningful progress on these issues. I think another thing that I've really been struck by is the CDFI industry is also in its own kind of period of racial reckoning. So, I know exactly who the reinvestment fund leader is that you're talking about. And I think the industry, even though it was born out of, the civil rights movement, it was sort of came out of a reaction to redlining. It's like, okay, how can we find our own capital to invest in communities because the banks won't do it? The industry, quite frankly, right now, too old, too white, too male dominated, right? It's perpetuating some of the same inequities that we're trying to solve for. And so I think CDFIs right now are really thinking through what does it mean to really be representative of a community, and how are we potentially causing harm by creating these structures in which we're, yes, we have to be accountable and we have people on our board, but are they, when it comes down to the decision makings of the individual institutions and who's on, and your executive staff, and who are you kind of bringing up and, grooming for leadership and things like that, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And so I'm heartened by the work of some of these institutions. They're, trade associations for African-American led CDFI CEOs and for Latino led CDFIs, because they know that they need, to come together to advocate for their collective interests. But beyond just like who's making decisions at the top, there's a whole thinking through of, who are our vendors and our suppliers? Are we making sure that we're putting a racial equity lens on, what investment firms we're using or what accountants we bring in? Are we, even when we order food for a lunch, how are we picking the businesses that we support? And really doing that top to bottom analysis of like, how can we be more equitable in the things that we do every day, and not just the dollars we're putting out on the street, but in our own actual institutions that we're setting up. And so I expect to see a lot more progress on that going forward. And that's something I'm really excited about.
It's great to hear. Just a brief comment on when you talked about your solutions. I'm struck by the fact that basically all three of you said this is not technically difficult. We know what we need to do. We need money and we need political will. Right? Fascinating. Now, for you, Ianna, I'm guessing it's a little more complicated to try to scale up what you're trying to do and maybe replicate your success around the country.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think just listening to all the different policy issues or structural issues that we've all been talking about, you peel one layer away, there's like 6 more to really kind of dig into and think about. And so, it's difficult to think about scaling and replicating, but I would encourage folks here locally in Philadelphia or in other places to really think about who are your other institutional partners. I will say it's been heartening to see, at least amongst community foundations, you mentioned before, there are not so many foundations that are engaged in the policy space, but as community foundations, we are public charities, so we don't have the same limitations that private foundations do on their ability to advocate and sort of be a little bit out there in ways that my former employer, Pew or MacArthur, or I guess Pew is a public charity, so they do that, but there are more community foundations who are really thinking thoughtfully and carefully about what their role is in advocating for policy change. The other thing that I want to reflect on is that the role that we occupy a really interesting space in whatever ecosystem. We're both supporting the ecosystem, but we also are a connector, and we can talk to different constituencies. So we both have our grantees and partners, but we also have our donors, and we have banks that hold our assets, and we have ways of having conversations with them about their role in all of this. And, I think CDFIs are a really important piece of the puzzle in meeting the lending needs in communities and the capital needs in communities. But there's also a need to hold those banks and institutions accountable to their role in lending in communities and being that community-based lender. CDFIs do an amazing job, but you're right, the need is so tremendous and great. And banks often say, well, the CDFIs are doing that work. And we're trying to really have a conversation with our trustee banks and others about how they can shape their role in a different way, and they can really be thoughtful about how are they meeting the small dollar needs so that folks don't have to go to a payday lender because they don't have other choices. So how do we have the conversations with them about these are real needs that communities have, and you're not meeting that need? And so I think there's an opportunity. We have, much like the Fed, a convening role to play in bringing folks together around those conversations. So scale does not quite scale, but it is replication of how do we sort of show up differently as an actor in the space that we occupy in the community foundation world within a city, an ecosystem of actors.
It's a great insight for the folks in Philly. Thank you. All right, we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. I see a hand here, then Sarah. Go ahead, please. Please be sure to then you, and be sure to just use the mic and identify your name and institution if you could.
Hi, I'm Rachel Meadows. I'm with the City Council of Philadelphia. Yeah, I was the one you pointed at, right? Okay.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to name a name, and I hope I don't offend anyone, but I am a graduate from there, and I also am still affiliated. But a colleague of mine in City Hall, we were talking about the University of Pennsylvania, and they essentially said they're pretty much a hedge fund that does higher ed on the side now. But that's somewhat true. I mean, they have over a $20 billion endowment. It's so much money. It's an insane amount of money. And then you think about the legacy in West Philly and all of this, but I feel like Kevin and Ianna, you kind of were talking about, I don't know if I'm just kind of looking for a reaction and thoughts on that, because I know there are other, institutions of higher ed that are in similar situations, but all the other ones want to be like that too. Like that's the system that is within the higher ed world. And it speaks to the student debt crisis as well. I mean, I wonder how many Penn grads have a lot of student debt, and the ones who are people of color, they probably have disproportionate levels of debt. And at what role do these institutions themselves play in that and solutions?
Okay, so thank you for your question. Hold that. Sarah, you want to put your question on the table?
Sure, thanks. And I think it's actually a similar question. I think we heard a couple times that today that, we know what to do to build wealth, but building wealth and reducing the divide are not the same thing. And Ray has heard me ask this question before. So, we've heard earlier today, the wealth divide is a product of racialized exclusion at one end, and also this kind of amped up racialized inclusion at the other end. And so you can keep raising the floor, but as long as the ceiling spirals out to, the rocket ship, the gap keeps growing. So I just wondered what folks were thinking about kind of that closing the gap or the divide versus raising the floor. And I'm Sarah Shiganti from the Boston Fed. Views are my own, not this.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Yes, I quite frequently at the Fed say there's a big difference between trying to reduce the gap and trying to build wealth up from the bottom. Very different policy agendas, and thank you for putting that on the table. Okay, one more question. Yes, please.
My question is to Ms. Williams. You talked about the microloans for small business. So I have been involved with some of that kind of stuff, but they also was associated with some banks. Is that true? Are you associated with some banks as well?
Yeah, start there and then we'll get the other two. Mm-hmm.
So banks are a major funder of a lot of CDFIs because of their Community Reinvestment Act obligations, quite frankly. They are able to provide low cost, long-term, sometimes capital to CDFIs in theory because we are able to reach the borrowers that are either too risky or too expensive for them to serve directly. And so, yes, sometimes, my organization, we have money from Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase and Truist and all the banks, right? And I think there's a role for that, right? I think there's that can make some sense. I think the flip side of that is we're basically getting pennies to clean up the huge messes that the banks have made. That's really what's happening here. And, I don't want to speak too out of turn because I do represent this organization, but, we are, we're trying to solve a huge problem with a little tiny bit of capital. And it's kind of a mismatch because, again, Wells Fargo opening up fake accounts and draining wealth out of communities through predatory mortgages and things like that. But, I'll give a $25 million loan to a CDFI and that's great, right? And so there are flaws in the system, right? I don't think that CDFIs are perfect at all, but it's one piece of a solution, right? It's just sort of you have to start somewhere. And so a lot of times the issue that CDFIs have is that we are as chronically undercapitalized and starved for resources as the communities that we're trying to serve. And so we have to get money from somewhere. There's a little bit of money coming out of the federal government, not enough. There's some money coming out of banks. There's some new interest from corporate partners, but it's still, again, we're up against a huge systemic problem. And, we just don't have the resources right now to really be able to combat, the things that are happening on the ground.
Thank you, Dafina. Do you guys want to take the Penn becoming a hedge fund question?
Yeah, no, that's true. Right now there's about $1.7 trillion in outstanding student loans in the United States. Who got all that money? Colleges. So that sounds like a system that's working pretty well for them, and therefore a system that they may have a strong interest in not changing, or at least no strong interest in trying to make any different. The solution to the debt problem, I said before, we can't just forgive the loans. We need to make sure people don't have them. And the solution is to make college less expensive on the front end. And there's a very active conversation around free college, right? Bernie Sanders, rode the idea of free college pretty close to the presidential nomination. It's become a very mainstream idea. President Biden proposed free community college just about a year ago, kind of fell by the wayside in the Build Back Better negotiations, but that was a very serious, very big, very real proposal. The enthusiasm for free college politically tends to follow along fairly familiar lines. I don't think I need to describe to everybody here. What not everyone always understands, though, is that colleges don't want to be free. I'm going to repeat that. Colleges don't want to be free for two reasons, one of which is, I think, pretty legitimate and one of which is not. The legitimate part of it is that if colleges are free, then they lose control over how much money they have to spend. And we live in a country of pretty rapidly polarizing, where the two parties are polarizing by education level very quickly. For a long time, there wasn't really any correlation between whether you were a college graduate and whether you were a Democrat or Republican. That is changing markedly right now. The biggest change in the composition of the parties is essentially that college-educated Republicans are becoming Democrats and Democrats without college degrees are becoming Republicans, which means now all of a sudden there's only one party that might want to fund higher education. And if that party is out of power and you're a college that's dependent on the government for your money, that makes you vulnerable. It makes you unstable. And I think that's a very legitimate concern. Much less, I would say, and this probably applies much more to private institutions like Penn, colleges like to be in the business of selling expensive, valuable things to rich people.